You're listening to episode 25 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. David Treleaven joins us to speak about mindfulness and trauma. Many of us come to practice from some suffering in our lives. Our usual, tried and true coping mechanisms aren't keeping up, and we're exploring some avenues we've not checked out before. There are some promising studies indicating mindfulness can help survivors of traumatic experiences continue that healing process. David Treleaven, PhD, is an educator, writer, and somatic therapist working in the San Francisco Bay Area. He teaches with Generative Somatics, an organization working to empower social and environmental justice movements through transformative practice, and is adjunct professor of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is currently writing a book about the relationship between mindfulness and trauma, and has a private somatic practice in the East Bay. And our guest today is David Treleaven. David, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
So tell us a little bit about your background, how you first encountered mindfulness.
Well, I first encountered mindfulness back as a teenager in Toronto. I had a good friend whose mom was actually leading a group for teenagers. And so I was probably 13 or 14 and went into this meditation group. I had no idea what I was getting into. And there was, when I sat down, there was just this feeling of feeling home, and something felt just really exciting about being in a group of people and being quiet and tuning into my sensations. And so that became a love that I followed for a number of years. And then in my 20s, got really interested in the intersection between mindfulness and meditation practice and psychotherapy, and started training as a psychotherapist in Vancouver in Canada, and just found the combination to be electric, and the conversation that was happening in the literature to be really exciting. So I spent a couple years really exploring the intersection of psychology and mindfulness practice. And then at some point really dove into practice, and for a number of years was going on a bunch of retreats. And then in 2006, I went on a longer-term 6-week retreat in Massachusetts. And I had a couple weeks of sinking into practice, and was going really well. And then at some point during the practice period, I had the experience of what felt like a circuit breaker going off in my body. I don't know how else to explain it, but at some point I had a lot of trouble connecting to sensations and found myself floating out of my body in the hall. And it was an experience I hadn't had before. And so I took it to the teacher. I had interviews set up every couple days and explained what was happening. And the teacher, who was great, said, yeah, but this could be a certain state. My suggestion is just take it back to the cushion and let yourself be mindful of that. And I would do that, and it didn't seem to be making matters much better. I didn't seem to be coming back into my body. And I ended up leaving the practice period much more, what I would say in retrospect, disassociated than I was when I went in. And so this opened up a whole conversation for me about, well, what happened on retreat? I didn't really understand, and opened up a number of conversations with colleagues and teachers. And eventually people pointed me towards trauma and trauma theory and therapy, which I hadn't, a word that I had never associated with my own history. And the more that I looked into it, the more that what had happened actually made a lot of sense in the context of trauma. And so that opened up an investigation that I've been in, I'd say, for the last 7 years, and continued to be in it.
So, asking about that experience, if we can just explore that a little bit. Prior to that experience, had you had any basic information or heads up from any of your teachers that these events do occur in practice? In, for example, the Zen tradition, we consider those. Makyo is one term that sometimes things come up, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong here. This is just part of the practice, and it's known to occur. And you're still here, you're still safe, and you're still doing the practice. Was there any kind of foundational setting of a guideline or a milestone or awareness that this could occur?
Mm-hmm. In retrospect, when I think back on the teachers who I love, I mean, I love this practice and continue to find it such a transformative practice, meditation and mindfulness. And the teachers who I were sitting with, when I think back, there was a real range of skill. Now, on one level, no. The answer to that question is that there wasn't a framework set up to say, hey, some difficult things might happen. I'd say there were certain teachers who would really stick to what felt like traditional instructions and say, just keep being mindful of that. Really stick with the practice and trust it, which I think we all need. And then on another level, there were teachers who I'd say were more psychologically inclined, who would, now that I think back on it, they were creating a map for me to say, if you need to back off of the breath sometimes, that would be okay. And they were still keeping it in the context of Buddhist practice. But in retrospect, no, I don't think that I really had a heads up that this level of difficulty could come up. It really took me off guard. And what I did is I kept applying the principles of the practice to it. And that seemed to be where I went off the rails. So that's what I think about that.
Was there any expertise or facilitation when you did come to someone and ask, here's what occurred, and I don't quite grasp what's going on, and it's a little shaking, that, well, here's some of the neurological basis. Here's what's happening. This is a normal brain event, and it's not something that is harmful to you. It can, of course, be very disorienting. But was there any explanation or guidance on, again, here's what may be happening for you, and it in itself is not a problem. It's what you do with it?
Not really. I'd say that we were all, on some level, we were all involved in what has become an emerging inquiry around when do you really just stick with it on the cushion, and when are moments where it might actually be skillful to take this remarkably powerful technology of mindfulness and just back off a little bit. And I'd say I got different answers from everyone, and we were all just in it together in some ways, exploring this. But there wasn't a framework that ever truly landed in my body like, yeah, that works. And it wasn't until I actually started to back up and have a look at mindfulness practice through the lens of the past couple decades of trauma research, where I said, oh, my experience is starting to make more sense. And I think there's going to be, there has been, and there'll continue to be, an integration between the insights of trauma therapy in Western psychology with traditional Buddhist practice as it's being practiced right now.
Yeah, it's interesting that you would get different answers. And of course, that makes sense because everyone's personal experience, every moment, is different. And I think it's helpful to remind people, or for new practitioners, to just say that you do need to be mindful, forgive the phrase, of where you are with the practice, and that mindfulness can have some things come up. And if they are proving to be problematic, it's okay to back off and adjust your practice accordingly. And mindfulness sometimes is not a practice for everyone. It might not be so beneficial to you to continue the practice. So it's always something we need to moderate and pay very close attention to. How are we doing? And it's not to say that we shouldn't reach or explore things that may sometimes be difficult. It's being aware of, when are we crossing the line into, I'm no longer growing from this experience, I'm harming myself, and being careful around that.
I love what you're saying. I want to jump in on that because I agree with you. I really think this is a question of practicality at some level. And one of the writers who really sent me onto this topic was Reggie Ray. He wrote a book a couple of years ago that some people might know called Touching Enlightenment, which was his exploration around embodiment and mindfulness practice. And he asked this question in line with what you're saying, where he said, we've been practicing, some of us have been practicing for 30 years. And he was quite vulnerable in saying, I'm in the question of how deeply we are transforming. Let's just look at that. So I'm interested in being at the table of the question that you're posing here of, well, what's really practical for people? And where this conversation led me was to say, mindfulness is an amazing technology and practice that remains so deeply transformative, especially in a culture that can tend to be quite disembodied. And if you look at mindfulness through a lens of trauma, we need it to heal. It's an essential mechanism and skill that we must learn to heal from overwhelming experience. But on the flip side of that, and this is part of the conversation with you here, is that I think practiced unskillfully, it can actually end up creating more problems for people that have a history of trauma, which I think challenges the idea that mindfulness in general is just a panacea. It should be okay for everyone. New practitioners should know that that's not the case for everyone.
Correct. Totally agree with you. And that's one of the things that's very challenging for teachers, is not only doing some information gathering about new students, new practitioners as they come on, to help them find what is the best kind of practice for them, because there are several different kinds of contemplative practices one can engage in, and you can shift things up as things arise. But also, as that practice continues and as things change, as the person grows, and as we all stumble, because we all do, it's very difficult for teachers to determine what is the best for this individual. A rote answer of just sit with it is not always going to be helpful to the person. And it's going to vary based on the circumstance. So, David, I want to ask, we've been using the word trauma. Maybe you could give us a little bit better of an understanding of what you mean by trauma, how that ties into trauma theory, and paint us the picture. What is the context here?
I think this is a essential part of any question when we're talking about trauma, is to actually try and set the parameters. And in having this conversation with many people, I'm aware there's a wide spectrum. So we could focus in on the diagnostic criteria that's outlined in what's known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is really the Bible for psychiatrists and mental health practitioners around mental health. We could focus there. And on the other side of the spectrum, I just want to acknowledge there's a number of people and Buddhist writers and teachers who would say that just being born into this body is traumatic. On some level, it is all trauma. We are swimming in that all the time. And what I'd like to propose for this conversation is that when I'm talking about trauma, I'm talking about the colloquial definition that I think we all use when we say trauma, or that maybe most people would use, which is that when we talk about trauma, we're saying that something bad happened, that on some level, a bad thing happened to a person or a group of people. And what's important is to recognize we will all face this at some point in our lives. Now, statistics say that in the US, 50% of us at some point will experience an overwhelming event that the majority of people would consider traumatic. But on some level, we were all going to face overwhelming experience. We'll eventually be facing death. But, the loss of a loved one, even just feeling into the environmental crisis that we have. Yesterday, I was in downtown San Francisco talking about this with a friend, and trauma is everywhere. We look around, lots of homeless people, people arguing. Trauma is really everywhere we look. Now, what's important is I want to make this distinction that when we're talking about trauma-related disorders, like post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, which many people have heard of, what is being said is that the bad thing that was experienced is on some level still happening. And this is the important point, is that we will all experience hard things. Some people will move through it and they won't be much worse for the wear. They'll remember it, but they won't actually have the experience that some people have, which is that trauma, it keeps happening. And this can happen in the form of intrusive memories or sensations. But there's a way that the overwhelming event doesn't get to complete in the body. And so what trauma is about is, on some level, it's about stuckness. It's that there was a natural process in our bodies that went off the rails and it didn't complete. And that creates a lot of havoc in the nervous system. And what's fascinating to me is that, having read through all the literature on trauma, a lot of contemporary writers say that in order for us to heal from trauma, we actually need to have a present moment experience of the body in a very clear way. And this is where the intersection of mindfulness and trauma is very alive. And I think it's a fascinating and complex conversation to be in, and that's where we are.
So tell us a little bit about that intersection and what you've run across as some of the research around how trauma is positively attenuated through a mindfulness practice. What is it about bringing yourself back to this present moment, the experience of embodiment, that makes that change in trauma?
That's great. That's usually where this conversation tends to go is, well, let's talk about the ways that mindfulness can really help. And I'll put it like this, that I think that mindfulness remains an essential practice of tuning us into our bodies and our sensations. And just that alone is a powerful transformative practice for most of the people that I know. And I want to get to how it is that mindfulness will help. And I think it might be helpful to unpack a little bit how it is that mindfulness can actually create some difficulty and some problems for people that have trauma. And I think that'll eventually answer the question about where it can help. When we're talking about trauma, we're talking about these basic factory-loaded responses that we have in our body. Many people know them as fight, flight, and freeze. And when I mentioned that there are some people that don't get to move through trauma, it's that they had some kind of overwhelming experience where their body said, we need to run away, or we need to fight this. And this natural immobility or freeze response comes over top and really contains this energy in the body. So it doesn't actually have the chance to move through the psychobiology and complete. And I have a story that a teacher of mine told me about this, which I think helps paint the picture. She was in San Francisco and was at an intersection where there's a series of timed lights, and a lot of cars end up running through these red lights. There was a family crossing the intersection about to step out. And as they did, a car blew through the intersection and went through a red light. And the mother had to take her child by the shoulder, really grab this kid and really yank him back and pull him onto the sidewalk. And my teacher was watching this and said that what inevitably happened, not surprisingly, is that this kid started to shake and cry and was really scared and was having a really natural response to what was an overwhelming experience. And so this kid was shaking and crying. And then what happened, and this is not in any way to shame the parent, the mother bent down to the child and put her arms on his shoulders and said, "Stop it. I need you to stop it." And you can imagine what this kid did, which is to hold his breath and really stuff the shaking and the crying that was happening. And so this is a small example of the ways that we will encounter overwhelming experience that doesn't have the chance to complete and run through the system. And this we could talk about this on a wide spectrum of minor times that something like that would happen. That's not to say that that event would be traumatic in and of itself, but if that happened a number of times, it would leave a certain residue in the body. And here's what happens because of trauma. So if someone comes into the meditation hall and they've had a history of trauma where a freeze has been really capping and containing what is powerful energy in the body, two things happen here. One is that we're left with a very painful legacy around unbearable sensations. And so traumatized people will consistently experience very uncomfortable and difficult sensations in their body because they're still feeling the remnants of a fight or a flight. So that means they might feel tension or a tight chest or they can't breathe. And so the body actually ends up becoming the enemy for a lot of people who have a history of trauma. The second thing it does is that it forces us to experience the present moment through the lens of the past. The body is still walking around or moving around as if the trauma is still occurring. And so we're taking in present moment information, but we're referencing it to an earlier overwhelming experience. And this challenges the idea that time will heal all wounds. And so this is the setup. This is where people are walking in, and that's how they might be coming into a basic meditation practice.
In fact, David, with the story of the child, and many of us have had an experience in our younger days that was difficult like that. And we've been faced with a parent or an adult or some other figure who gave us that same kind of setup of stop. And unfortunately, in this situation, out of an innocence, again, this is not shaming the parent. We have all done this and made this same action. Is in addition to the traumatic event itself, which is this sharp yanking and almost getting hit by a car, we're then faced with, and what your response is, this shaking, this fear, this response of, wow, that was a big thing. We're now informed that that's wrong and that we need to close that off. And we're adding on a level of confusion because we are genuinely feeling this. And there's a very good reason to, with being told we shouldn't feel this and what our response is wrong. There's also a confusion thrown into the cognitive dissonance of the whole situation itself. So we're even adding on to the complexity of that one event.
You're bringing up such an important point, and these are some of the people that I'm interested in reaching through this research and writing, is that I hear you really talking about shame, that we're having a very natural response to an experience, and then there's a way that a family, community, or institution can, whether intentional or not, can shame us and tell us that was wrong. And getting back to my experience, when I was on my longer term retreat, there was a way that when I couldn't move through the activation that was happening in my body, when mindfulness didn't seem to be actually helping the practice, I went into a ton of shame. Like, gosh, I must be a terrible meditator. I can't seem to get this right. And so I think that's a really important point, is the number of people who will interface with meditation practice and have difficulty actually moving through some of these experiences in practice, or gets really stuck in practice. There was a way that I think that you can bump your heads against the concrete wall of a traditional practice and say, it must be my fault. I must not be doing it. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's very important to note that there's a reason the very first attitude described in a traditional mindfulness-based stress reduction program is non-judging. And it's also one of the hardest things for us, whether it's as light and innocuous as, oh, my attention wandered, and bringing it back to whatever your object of meditation is, whatever the experience you're trying to have is, and just letting that be. And it's a very challenging thing for us to let that go and not judge ourselves, but simply notice and return. And that judging is deeply embedded, I think, in our culture.
I agree. And, what you said about not shaming the parent, I think in this conversation that there's no intention of shaming the parent or even the meditation teachers that I'm talking about. This is really, we're in this lived inquiry. And ideally, if that parent had some experience or training in trauma, what they would have done would be to really let that process that was happening just continue and say to the little kid, listen, you're doing great. That was really scary. Go ahead and let that shaking happen. And so then that tremendous amount of energy runs through the body, and then trauma doesn't happen. But that's not often what happens in our culture. And so this is really just trying to provide more information for people that are in such a powerful practice as mindfulness to just be considering what some people would be walking into the hall having experienced, and that they might need some different things.
David, what are some of the questions that you have or areas you want to see explored in this idea of trauma in our practice?
At this point, I'm just really interested in being in the conversation of what happens at the intersection of mindfulness and trauma-related disorders. Genuinely, like what can we look to mindfulness to, and what's our responsibility as teachers or clinicians, if you're leading a mindfulness-based program, what is the level of responsibility that we face? How much should we take this on? Is mindfulness about healing trauma? I just have a lot of questions about what is actually helpful. And I'm not sure right now. I have questions about what would a trauma-sensitive mindfulness retreat look like? Or perhaps if a teacher was in a class of people who had all, said, I've experienced trauma, how often, how long would they sit? There isn't research here. So a lot of the questions I have been unanswered, but I'm wanting to be in the conversation of pointing to certain factors that I think can make mindfulness practice more difficult. I wanted to talk about one great metaphor that Peter Levine uses. Peter Levine is a pretty famous trauma writer who has a methodology called somatic experiencing. And he uses the myth of Medusa to talk about how it is that we actually need to move through trauma. And why he uses this is to say that when we're dealing with trauma, we're dealing with really powerful sensations that if we directly confront them, then we might end up overloading the system, our nervous system. And so he uses this example of the way that Medusa was actually slain was that, I forget actually the name of the
Perseus.
Perseus, thank you. Perseus had a shield and didn't look directly into Medusa's eyes. And so this is, and goes kind of back and forth. And in order to get close to Medusa, doesn't look Medusa directly. And this is why I think mindfulness can be so challenging for people that come into the practice without any kind of awareness about trauma, is that the tendency, if you ask a traumatized meditator to sit down and pay attention to what's predominant, then at some point they will tune into what we call trauma-based or trauma-related sensations that still live on in the body. The brain will naturally attend to these places. And typically mindfulness practices will, stay with what's predominant. So in some ways, basic mindfulness practice can be like throwing someone into Medusa's lair and saying, just pay attention. And of course, your eyes will be drawn to Medusa. And so this is where this is the conversation, is how do we develop nuance where we are helping people to learn how to be with their own experience of Medusa inside, but also recognize that it's going to be different for everyone. And just to have that information I think might be a good starting point.
I think that's a very good metaphor on a number of levels. And if we properly equip, particularly new meditators, people who are just starting a contemplative practice, with some foundational understanding, in other words, we give them the mirrored shield and the awareness that these are temporary states, things arise and fall. Practice that in the beginning, typically with something like the breath, and an understanding that if we just toss them into Medusa's lair, they're going to be drawn to Medusa and they will freeze into stone. The most primitive part of our brain's response to stress is that freeze. There's not even an opportunity for fight or flight. And yet, if they come in with a shield that we give them to say that, this is not the experience itself. You are here sitting in a room full of people who are also going through their own stuff and they're also doing the practice. You're not alone and things are going to come up. Here's your mirror shield to not look at that as directly because it's going to turn you to stone, but have a reflection of that. And really any of the things that we have happening in our bodies and our minds, and really no separation there, are reflections of past or creations of future. And the only experience right now is this moment. I think that would be a very helpful foundational equipping of new people for contemplative practice.
I agree. I think it's really gets to your point earlier of it's helping create a basic framework for experience that the Buddha and it's all been mapped out in different ways. And I think this is another tool that will equip people to be able to be in such a transformative practice. I'm not saying in any way that we should try to shield ourselves from all sensations. This is where mindfulness remains so revolutionary, is that we do need to actually inhabit our bodies to heal from trauma, or I think to transform, period. And then to be willing to be in the nuance of the conversation that says, there might be times where actually the most skillful application of mindfulness is to back off. So yeah, I agree with you. And I love the metaphor or the use of the myth, because actually that gets back to the biological foundation of trauma, which is you literally do freeze. You literally do turn to stone with immobility when you look at Medusa directly in the eyes. So it's a really powerful metaphor. And I encourage anyone who's interested in, who doesn't know much about trauma, but is interested. Peter Levine's writing is fantastic. And he wrote a book in an unspoken voice a couple of years ago, which really lays out this kind of theory in more detail.
And actually, there's more. The myth itself doesn't end there. When Perseus finishes off Medusa, and he essentially defeats the monster, from her blood springs Pegasus, the winged horse. And so there's this wonderful capability to grow in flight that comes out of defeating our personal monsters.
I'm not sure. I think he references that in the book. And I think that's such an important point, is that I've been now working in the field of trauma for 5 to 10 years. And a lot of clients will come in and at some point in their healing process will say, why did this happen to me? Why do I have this experience, this really difficult experience? And then when I see people on the other side of a process of healing from trauma, there's a way that their capacity to experience life and their own knowledge of self and of their experience, it's just grown immensely. And so much possibility can actually come out of healing trauma. I work with an organization called Generative Somatics. And we do trainings with people, and the program is called Somatics and Trauma. And we're working with a lot of social justice organizers, and we actually incorporate meditation practice into the program. And what is so powerful is in working with a lot of people who have been targeted by oppression and have experienced trauma, there's a way that collectively in that room, when people turn towards their trauma, or you could say turn towards Medusa, and are willing to face it and look at it, which I really think lies at the base of meditation and mindfulness practice, is a willingness to turn in and look clearly at what's happening. there is this remarkable energy that gets released in the room, that the power of people really turning and facing their history and their conditions is such a powerful thing to be a part of. So I'm glad you said that about the myth. I think that's a really appropriate second part, and I'll have to go back and read the whole thing.
Well, our guest today has been David Treleaven. You can find out more about his work on his website, davidtreleaven.com, and I'll be linking that on the episode page for this episode, as well as a link to the Generative Somatics site. And David, you're also working on a book on mindfulness practices for trauma, so I hope you will join us at a future date when that's published.
I will. I look forward to it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.